Okay.
Okay.
So people are probably joining, and
They are indeed. We have over 50 people already. So, okay, everyone. Welcome to our International Book Club. And we're going to be talking to the amazing Pamela Fuller and discussing her amazing book on the Leader's Guide to Unconscious Bias. But before we go there, let me just do a few moments of housekeeping. We so want your inputs. I've already received so many questions and ideas, etc., on the website or in LinkedIn. So I will be asking those questions. But if you have any questions, pop them into chat and we'll make sure we get those to Pamela. And you'll recall that the criteria for our book were books written last year in our new world, books that were quintessentially global in their availability, and books that we felt might be relevant to every single one of us. And Pamela's work, The Leader's Guide to Unconscious Bias, has really received some extraordinary acclaim. And Pamela herself has been tied to the issues of inclusion with a deep emphasis on exploring the impacts of bias of all types and pushing month on month, year on year, to have quite extraordinary progress. For over 15 years, she's worked with both the public and the private sector, supporting clients that you'd all know and solving some pretty complex problems. And she's currently serving as the Franklin Covey's thought leader on inclusion and bias, as well as a global client partner responsible for some of Franklin Covey's most strategic partners. So Pamela, I'm going to stop there about you. Is there anything that I should add or anything that you would say so that the people who are still joining the call know a little bit about you before we start talking about the book?
Yeah, I started my career actually in nonprofit doing fundraising and advocacy, and then had the opportunity to work at the U.S. Department of Defense in an Office of Equal Employment Opportunity and Diversity. So really got to dig into issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And then, as you mentioned, joined Franklin Covey initially as a sales leader. But I've just always had this real passion around issues of inclusion and bias, really born from my own background and identity as a first generation American, as a Black woman, as a Latina, right? As the mother of two brown boys. My boys are 4 and 11 and must be included in any introduction, right? And as a result, I have a fondness for superheroes and Ninja Turtles. But just really thrilled with the global reception of the book. I think particularly in the context, and well, I guess I'll step back and say I was so honored by this invitation for that reason, right? I think before the events of this summer, and even still, people struggle with some issues of identity as uniquely American problems. And I think we know that identity and race, right, and gender and socioeconomics, right, all of these things about our identity are global issues, right? And there is, of course, local context in every circumstance, but I've just been really pleased with the global reception to the book, that it is relevant in those global environments and multilateral and multinational environments. So I'm thrilled to talk with you today and see what your readers think.
Fantastic. Well, one of the first questions that came up a lot, you start the book highlighting how much the world changed in the 2 weeks that your editors had the manuscript, with the resurgence, the rightful resurgence of Black Lives Matter. And I wonder, you started with that amplification, and throw some context or some light through the aperture of that for you and the book.
Yeah, so writing a book is a long process, right? And so our team worked for the better part of a year on this book, and the ideas, of course, had been ruminating for the last 3 years. And we finally submit the manuscript to the publisher. And we're so relieved by that and feeling celebratory. And then, George Floyd is murdered. And the protests, first domestically and then internationally around racial injustice, kick off. And the context in which the book would be published fundamentally changed, right? So it went from purely organizational, of course, pulling in personal experience, but a real focus on organizational leadership, leading from wherever you are in an organization and doing so consciously, right? Really thinking about the role that your biases play in your decision, to a larger awareness, right? And a larger context in terms of people's personal lives, right? I think the social aperture for this dialogue increased, and an increased appetite for specific dialogue on race. And so we decided to include a preface to the book that really took into account that context, and work to make the connection between the work we do in organizational inclusion efforts and the work happening in larger society. I think it actually resulted in a nice bookend with the conclusion, because in the conclusion, we also talk about public policy, right? And the reality that in many countries, people of certain identities have not even had sort of full rights when it comes to workplace protections and equal opportunity. And so we talked a little bit at the front end, of course, of the most egregious discrimination and harassment and abuse and sometimes murder, and all of the challenges that brings up, and then sort of bookended with, if we can implement these things, we see public policy improvements that impact society, and then we can take that further into the workplace.
Fabulous. And two people who are on this call, two of my favorite people. So the lovely Gemma Clarkson and Kate Ula have asked about can bias be institutionalized? You've talked about the individual impact, the biases we all have. And what I love about the book is the way that you, first of all, as I put in my review, kind of park the fact that, you're malevolent and mean and dreadful if you have a bias. But there is a question around how do organizations have bias, and how do they get them?
Yeah, I think one of the things I mentioned, I work for the US Department of Defense. And so I think the military in most countries is really good at building leaders in their own image, right? So you think about boot camp, and enlisted soldiers go to boot camp, and they're sort of broken down and then rebuilt in the image of the Army or the Air Force or whatever it might be. But I think all organizations do that, right? And so it is really interesting. Organizations reward common or consistent behavior, and organizations have biases about, whether they take on risk or not, right? How they innovate, who gets to have ideas, how they identify talent and potential. And those become institutionalized. And sometimes that is very blatant, right? Like we recruit from the same one or two schools, and everyone on our leadership team knows each other, right? They know each other from their social circles, or from their sort of elite hobbies, or from the schools that they attended, right? And it sometimes can be, and quite often is, much more subtle, right? In that people might not know each other, but ultimately the way that you move through the leadership ranks is by making decisions in a certain way, or by presenting yourself in a certain way. And so in some organizations, that is, you will see that only the most introverted, sort of technically minded leaders will progress through the organization, or people who are more cautious, right, or more financially driven, or leaders only come from the sales force, they don't come from the other parts of the organization, or whatever it may be. And sometimes it's about identity, right? Why is our executive team all men? Or why are there no people of color in our leadership ranks? Right. And so I think organizations, certainly they get into a habit or a process, and that becomes their strategy, right? It becomes the way that they lean into decision making and operating.
One question that's come up quite a bit, as you know, I mentor and business coach an array of quite young individuals, and the impact of COVID, the work from home. How do, in the environment where you're working and living your life on Zoom, and you feel that there is bias or impact to your progression, how in this environment can young people who would, and you give some wonderful examples in your book of the face-to-face meetings around the water cooler, how you deal with people who kind of steal your ideas or put you down. What is your advice for people who are trying to progress and feel there is a bias in this work from home, totally Zoomed environment?
Yeah, I think it requires a lot more intention and planning. So, sometimes on a Zoom meeting, you're in person and something comes up in a meeting, and you have the opportunity, as you all are literally exiting the conference room, to sort of pull that person aside and chat with them. Or the meeting is longer, and so you can sort of process it and perhaps come back around to it. But Zoom and the way in which we're all living, I think we're leaning more heavily into efficiency, right? Trying to have shorter meetings because we're all struggling with the Zoom fatigue. And so sometimes something might not even occur to you as problematic until after the fact, or it sort of slaps you in the face in the meeting. And because of efficiency and because of this virtual world, and 70% of human communication is nonverbal, you're not quite sure how to address it. And so I recommend sort of planning and communicating your intent. So reaching out to a person to say, I'd like to talk about something that happened in the meeting this morning that sort of struck me. And do you have some time where you might be able to focus in on that conversation? And I think it's important to acknowledge that there are times in the day, right, sort of towards the end of the day when my kids are looking for dinner and looking for me, right? That's not the best time for me to have a difficult conversation. So acknowledging in your communication or in your planning, what would be a good time for you to have this conversation and really be able to hear what I'm saying, giving someone the ability to really sort of prepare themselves. I think there are many environments where people are not turning their cameras on because of Zoom fatigue, right? Or they turn their camera on for client-facing things, but not internal things. And so this is a time when you might say, "I'd love to talk when you can have your camera on," because I just want to make sure that we really understand each other. And I think it's important to be as face-to-face as we can, if you will.
I think that's sorry.
Oh, and I was just going to say also to ensure that you're sort of leading with questions, right? Seeking clarity on what occurred versus getting someone on the Zoom to just accuse them outright of something, right? It just we don't respond well to accusations. We do respond well to answering questions and sincerity and curiosity.
Yeah, there's like so much of your book, it's so actionable with the sections to, explore the scenarios. And one of the things I loved about it, I've been building diverse and inclusive teams my whole career, but I think it was page 86 where you say words matter. What's appropriate and inclusive evolves and changes over time. It's essential to listen, watch, learn, engage, and re-engage. And I think that is a ticket for every single one of us to read the book and ensure that we're current. And we got a great question in from Lydia, who said, the topic that you discussed around Black Lives Matter will resonate with people who feel that they were the victims of unconscious bias. But to what extent does it also reach the culprits, those who are biased and mete it out? So I think that question is saying, everyone who's interested in this is on this call, reading the book. How do we all reach those that may not pick up a Pamela Fuller book or do not think that they have any biases? What is your recommendation, your guide, your advice as we help someone who is a blocker or is just not getting it and would no more read your book or come to this call than fly?
Yeah. So I think the self-promotional answer is to gift them a copy of the book. But I think in truth, we do talk in the book quite a bit. I mean, the whole sort of part one of our model around how we identify bias is about building self-awareness. And I think that people who are very consciously biased might make overt statements. They might be dismissive, right? We've seen some of that in the media, organizational leaders being dismissive, and they are held to account when they are very public facing, quite often, right, by losing their job or experiencing cancel culture, I think there are many more leaders who are not so overt. And having conversations with them to the extent possible, and really leaning into whatever their interest is in learning and thinking about performance. But ultimately, you don't have to agree with the ideas, right? If you think that diversity, equity, and inclusion are political issues and have no place at work, for example, my job is not to convince you that it's not political. My job is to convince you that it is impacting performance. Right? That if someone feels that they are marginalized or diminished or less than valued, right, that impacts their performance. People on the receiving end of bias are 3 times as likely to leave their jobs within a year, 3 times as likely to withhold ideas, and 3 times as likely to be disengaged. And so as leaders think about, and as people think about the importance of employee engagement, there's the reality that you can have the best strategy, you can have the best products, you can have the best of everything. If your people are not engaged, they're not going to do the things, right, to help you be successful. And so I think leaning into that connection to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging is a really powerful starting point. It's like, think whatever you want to think about it. I'm not here to be your moral judge.
No.
But
and I think
in your daily behavior, you need to apply, right? You need to apply these skills.
Absolutely. And it's only enthusiasm making me interrupt you. I do apologize.
No.
I was going to say International Women's Day, the whole, we have to challenge some of these things in a constructive way, and challenging with the performance card in the workplace. But there's also another line that people are asking for your advice on. I think all of us at some point, whether we're born in the middle of Nowhereville, who have felt like outsiders, like, they're on the wrong side or they don't belong. And you give in the book some lovely, what I would call bridging mechanisms. But share some of the things that you have some lovely quotes in your book. There are some marvelous leaders doing great work here, whether it's Werner Myers at Netflix and Anne Lamont. They're just some incredible leaders. But share, for those who haven't quite finished the book yet, a couple of sort of how you bridge that gap, how, without making people feel even worse, bringing them in to a network of support and inclusion.
Yeah, so we talk in the book about sort of coping with bias and being an ally, right? And ways that we can apply courage. We also talk a lot about connection. And I feel really strongly about the power of connection, really leaning into empathy and curiosity, that we think of these as natural feelings, but they are skills, right? So we have natural empathy, sort of sense of connection when we see similarity in another person, when we see ourselves reflected in other people. But when we use the skills of curiosity, right, when we ask critical questions and lean into the responses and really listen, you sort of end up digging around, rooting around in another person, and it leads to empathy or points of connection, right, in places where we might not naturally feel that. And so I think one of the things that, there's this quote attributed to Lincoln, and I don't know, it's one of these, like, it lives on the internet, and maybe Lincoln said it, or maybe someone said it last year, but it says, I do not know this man, I do not like this man, I must get to know him better. Right. And so I think when we feel a natural sort of dislike or distaste, that is an opportunity for us to explore what biases might be at play and think differently about how we connect with that person. If you think about how you connect with someone you love, right, or you like, and how long you give them to respond, and how long those conversations are, and how you start that conversation, and contrast that with how you engage in a conversation with someone you dislike, and how long that conversation takes, and how you start that conversation, and what words you use, right? There's always contrast difference, and it becomes self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If you lean into the dislike, it grows. If you lean into the opportunity, that can grow as well.
Yes. And the medium, Pamela, there's been a few questions here around, and this can have a slight age dimension to it. Our Generation Zers and millennials have worked this out, but for others of us, the connection, in social media, and some organizations have very clear guidelines about what you can and can't say and how you can support and lean in. What is your guidance about how you use these powerful social connections, social media, to voice your challenge or to demonstrate your bridging and being an ally and an advocate? Or do you think it is best not done in that way?
I really love social media. Now, I understand completely it's a double-edged sword, right? So I think there's a lot of nonsense on social media. And of course, if your head is in your phone all day, you're not connecting with the people who are actually around you, right? But social media is allowing us to have this conversation with all of these readers. So there is incredible power in social media and so much information, right? So the reality that I may never know a person of XYZ identity, right?
Yeah.
So I may never know, I don't actually know very many trans people, and I certainly don't have a close relationship with a trans person. And there are people who don't actually know or have close relationships with a Black person, right? Or a woman who is an executive, or all kinds of different identities. And social media allows us to bridge that gap, right? To learn more about those people's experiences and to amplify those voices. There was a great initiative over the last few months around taking over people's social media, right? And people in prominent positions handed their social media to activists and journalists and thinkers, right? And DEI professionals and practitioners, and gave them their audience, right? Because the audience of a model, right, or a famous pop star won't necessarily be following activists, but this is a way that they could be exposed to those ideas. So I think social media can be quite powerful as a mechanism for exposing us to things that we might never experience in our day-to-day lives, just sort of walking in the world, the limitations of geography and how we spend our time. And I think there is a way to be impactful and respectful on social media, right? So when you share things that you disagree with or you find egregious, being really clear about why you disagree and why you find it egregious versus saying something is stupid or saying something, right, using derogatory language about that thing.
Yes. Now, are you positive about the future? I ask this, Pamela, because, the role of working mums through COVID is clearly, from the research, harder, not easier. We've had very senior business people, chairmen of major public companies, KPMG, in the last weeks or so. We've had a Home Secretary in the UK saying that Black Lives Matter is a dreadful movement. I mean, people in the public domain, people who represent organizations or countries. Are you hopeful that the tens of people who've joined this and the thousands that have written in about it, are you positive? And what would you encourage everyone that's participated in this to do to move that positivity forward?
I would not do this work if I were not largely hopeful about it, right? Because then I'm spinning my wheels and it's a waste of effort. And I think progress is rarely moves as quickly as we'd like it to, but it's still moving, right? And it's a bit like running. So I am an amateur runner. I'm not very fast, but I try really hard and I enjoy it quite a bit. And when you're running, right, when you run I remember running my first 10K and I was sort of watching the scenery go by. It's like, I'm moving so slow, and I'm inching along and I'm not making as much progress as I'd like to. And then, an hour later, I'm at the end of 10K and I can look back and say, wow, I ran all that way. And I feel like diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging work is similar, that it feels slow while you're in the thick of it. and people say things that you find egregious, and it's unbelievable to you that you have to defend something that feels so clear. But then we see that macro action, right? That every difficult conversation you've had, every story that you've amplified, every way that you've pushed against your own biases and tried to communicate that progress leads to macro change. And so I think this is a space where people are prone to say, well, I can't do anything about it, but my leader can, right? Only the CEOs can do things about this, or only the world's leaders can do things about this. And it's simply not true. I mean, we can each do something about this, and collectively society's expectations around this are changing, so that some of the people who are saying really egregious things, at least in a corporate context, are suffering significant ramifications, right? They are being held to account in a way that they were not being held to account even 2 years ago.
Absolutely. Pamela, it's just been so wonderful to get to know you. Your book is truly the most amazing guide. And I want to thank you, and the questions and the interest in what you're doing is absolutely immense. I want to respect everyone's time and let us go. Please, for those as part of the International Book Club, it's going to be impossible to follow Pamela, but we have to do that with our next book. So this book came from a recommendation from one of our networks. We're looking for the next one, but a big round of applause to Pamela Fuller. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me, Harriet, and thanks everyone for joining and for supporting this work.
Pleasure.